You are listening to Csuite Perspectives, a podcast series from the Conference Board, providing business leaders with trusted insights for what's ahead.
Welcome to this episode of C-Suite Perspectives, a new podcast series by the Conference Board. These ongoing conversations will take an objective, data-driven look at a range of timely issues that matter most to business executives. To help make sense of these business challenges, we'll sit down with thought leaders and do what we do best, provide insights for what's ahead. I'm Steve Odland, the CEO of the Conference Board and the host of this podcast series. And in today's conversation, we're going to talk about the challenges and opportunities of multiple stakeholder governance. So how are companies governing and leading in a way that considers the needs and the views of all of their multiple stakeholders? And joining me today to discuss this subject is Paul Washington. Paul's the Executive Director of our ESG Center. Paul, welcome.
Thanks very much, Steve. Glad to be here.
So, Paul, you and I have talked about this, but in 1970, Milton Friedman wrote an essay which has become known as the Friedman Doctrine, and it lays out what is purported to be the treatise for shareholder primacy, focus only on the stockholder. But as every CEO and business executive knows, that in order to serve the shareholder, you also have to serve all the other stakeholders. So the customers, the employees, the owners, society, take care of the environment, as well as play well with the regulators and be a good corporate citizen. So as you think back to the Friedman Doctrine, what did Friedman actually say, and how is that related to the debate today over shareholders versus stakeholders?
Sure, thanks. Friedman's position has sometimes been caricatured. To be fair to him, he acknowledged that a corporation could consider the welfare of communities, employees, and others in considering what's in the best long-term interest of the corporation. So he said it was fine to make charitable contributions and so forth. He did, however, object to the notion that a corporation itself has any social responsibilities, or that those who work for a company have any obligation other than to increase profits so long as it stays within the rule of the game. I think he was being, in some ways, deliberately provocative at the time he was writing in 1970. But having said that, most companies didn't adopt the Friedman Doctrine at the time. That's one reason why he wrote the piece, because he felt like companies weren't as focused on stockholder profits as he thought they should be. But more fundamentally, I think things have really changed significantly, even in the last few years, in terms of shifting from a focus on stockholder primacy to, as you put it, multi-stakeholder governance. First, I think companies are being asked to take the lead, even more than government, on addressing an array of social and environmental topics more than ever before. We put out an annual report on sustainability disclosure practices around the globe, and there are literally 92 topics, social and environmental topics and others, that we track each year. Second, not only is the array of issues companies are grappling with broader, but the pressure on companies to take a stand is even greater. We recently put out some research report that said 99% of employees, this was globally, expect their companies to take stands on social issues. That's extraordinary. And we're finding that employee pressure is a significant mover for corporations. And in addition to those two things, a third factor at play is that the companies really are making their decisions in different ways in the past. The priorities are different, and the consideration set they have is different. They truly are considering environmental factors, social impact into decisions about what they produce, where they produce it, how they produce it, and not just for themselves, but throughout their entire value chain. So I think there really is a genuine shift underway. We may never have lived in the pure Milton Friedman world. I think even then, he didn't really believe, he was stretching things a little bit to make a point. But we are very far from where we used to be, I think, even 5 years ago.
Well, it's interesting because Friedman in this article, it doesn't get quoted very much, but Friedman in this article says, hey, you're using the assets of a corporation, you're using the leverage of the customers, the employees and owners, and a CEO goes out and in his or her name makes this proclamation or takes a point of view on a social issue. And how is that in the best interest of the other stakeholders in the organization. Go ahead and do that on your own. Don't do that in the name of the corporation. And I think that's interesting in today's debate, because if you talk to today's CEOs, we're split right down the middle in terms of, should we make social proclamations, or should we stay out of politics and social issues and stick to the knitting of the corporation? What say you?
No, it's a great question, and it's a big challenge for companies. Companies in some ways are really what I would call soft targets right now for pressure from employees or outside groups or others who want them to take stands on social issues, which often have a highly political and partisan aspect to them, because corporations are responsive organisms, and so when they hear from folks, they feel under a need to speak up. And there is a real danger that companies, which are now regarded as more trustworthy than media or government, could become as sort of polarized and as partisan as those other institutions, and thereby lose their trust. So I think there are probably a few things that each company needs to do to make sure that the CEO isn't just using the company as a platform to express his or her views, or is just not parroting the views of others. The first thing is, we think companies really ought to have clear criteria for deciding when they're going to engage on an issue. It's easy to say you should engage on an issue when it links to your company's values, but those values can be kind of squishy and broad, right? So we really think the companies ought to focus on whether there's a link between the company's business and whether the company, by speaking up, can have an impact. Those two criteria can help really focus what a company should speak up on. Second, companies should have a process in place where it's not just the CEO talking to the chief communications officer about taking a stand. There really ought to be a rigorous process in place too. The third thing, and this is really important, I don't think as many people have paid attention to this, is the importance of educating and engaging employees about the company's approach to political and social issues. It's really important to set expectations for employees that they can express as you said, they can express their own views, just like the CEO can, but that the company is not necessarily going to be a megaphone for those views. And then finally, I think for any CEO who does decide to speak up, it's really important to phrase your position in a way that doesn't just parrot the language of others, but that really is inclusive, respectful of people of different viewpoints, and is grounded in the company's own mission and values. I think those things help.
You said it's important to set expectations, and I really think that's an incredibly insightful comment, because there are expectations from all the stakeholders that CEOs should do X, Y, and Z, but this country is split down the middle at the moment in terms of opinion. So you by taking a statement on one side, left or right, or whatever you're saying, you can polarize the issue. You can delight half of your customers, employees, owners, but you can also offend half of them. And so it comes back to what you said, setting criteria, setting expectations, and so forth. But that's just one aspect of multi-stakeholder. Multi-stakeholder, though, goes beyond just the commentary. It goes to, how do you treat each one of these and how do you prioritize them? So what's the right way to think about, managing the company, beyond the commentary, but managing the company such that all of these stakeholders are taken into account?
The way I think about it is sort of in concentric circles. The central circle is the company itself and its long-term welfare. The next circle outside of that are your stakeholders. And I would put investors there, your employees, your customers, your business partners, your regulators. The next circle beyond that is society at large. And the circle outside of that is the natural environment. And I think as companies are trying to aim for sustainable and inclusive capitalism that really works for everyone, and we all know that capitalism is under siege in a lot of ways, I think it's helpful for companies to, when they're making their decisions, to open up their decision-making aperture beyond the company and the investors and consider all of those others, and to consider employees and customers not just as inputs, but also as constituencies to be served. and society and the environment. What is your impact on those? Now, in every case, each company is going to decide how much weight it's going to put on each of those circles. But I think it's helpful to consider all of them, especially when making major decisions.
We're talking to Paul Washington, the executive director of the ESG Center at the Conference Board. So, Paul, it sounds like, the focus on multi-stakeholder is here to stay because it's something that CEOs and management teams need to balance from here to eternity. What should be the board role in all of this?
Yeah, that's a great question. Look, in some ways, the board's role is what it has always been, which is that it needs to balance the various interests at stake. It needs to make determinations considering all the investors and other stakeholders' timetables and so forth. So the board, in some ways, has a very traditional role. And it needs the things that are sometimes overlooked in a lot of the discussion about the role of the board today. Every single director needs to have sound judgment, independence, knowledge of the industry, an understanding of the role of the board versus management, and an ability to work well with others. So in that sense, the board's role is rather the same. But I do think that things are changing for boards as well. First, as boards are taking on, companies are looking at issues through a broader lens, I think it increases the benefits of board diversity, both demographic diversity and diversity of backgrounds and perspectives. If you're tackling environmental issues, if you're tackling issues of impact outside the United States on society, it really does help to have people with experience in those areas. And even if they don't have experience themselves, it's important for the board to become fluent in discussing those topics. Another thing that's different is that, traditionally boards just met with themselves and with management. And then there's been an increasing focus on director engagement with shareholders. We're now seeing that engagement clearly cover ESG topics as well, a whole array of environmental and social topics. But we're also seeing board members, not at every company by any means, but sometimes board members are also directly engaging with employees. So that's changed for them. And especially after Black Lives Matters last year, you had board members reaching out to talk to employee groups more broadly and employee resource groups. And so directors were taking on a new role. I guess the bottom line, though, for boards in this era is it's just a lot more work. More is expected of boards than ever before.
Yeah, no, it clearly is. And but you said something that it was interesting because you said board members need to be able to deal across all of these issues. But that's different than what people were saying a few years ago, which is you need an IT expert on the board, and you need a marketing expert on the board, and you need this expert. In other words, balkanizing the board for expertise. But that's not what you're saying here.
No, you're exactly right. I'm not saying that. And in fact, I think sometimes the focus on board expertise is misplaced for a couple of reasons. First, you should focus on whether you've got expertise in management in these areas and you've got diversity of backgrounds in management. Don't put all the burden on the board. Second, another thing that can happen is if you've got someone who's a guru on cyber on your board, that may be great, but it can have two negative impacts. It can mean that other directors will just defer to that one director and not get up to speed themselves. And sometimes the person you brought on who's a guru in one area may not be a good all-around director. So I actually think having fluency in an area is across your board is frankly more important than having a lot of specified sort of expertise. I'm not against people having expertise where it's necessary, but I do think fluency is more important.
Yeah, and you've written on this that it's the job of management to run the company, and if you hire somebody on the board who's an expert in one little sliver, it devolves into the board trying to run the company, and then the accountabilities get all jumbled up. So it's an interesting situation. Well, we've talked about what multi-stakeholder focus means for the board. We'll cover next what it means for the C-suite. We're going to take a short break and be right back with more of our conversation with Paul Washington.
Interested in this content? You can find this and much more at our Conference Board website, www.conference-board.org. Or, even better, contact our membership team and your company can enjoy the benefits of our in-depth research around the economy, environmental, social, and governance issues, public policy, marketing and communications, and human capital. As a member of the conference board, you will be able to have full access to all of our cutting-edge research, leading indicators, benchmarking, and data services, in addition to webcasts and podcasts such as the one you are enjoying now.
Hello and welcome back to C-Suite Perspectives. I'm your host, Steve Odland, the CEO of the Conference Board, and I'm joined today by Paul Washington, the Executive Director of our ESG Center. Okay, so Paul, we've been talking about multi-stakeholder focus. We talked about the Friedman doctrine and all that kind of stuff. We've talked about the board. What about management? How does a management team, how does the C-Suite deal with this multi-stakeholder challenge?
I actually think that it's going to be transformative for the C-Suite. As you know, Steve, we've got a series of roundtables underway on this topic. A lot of organizations have talked about the shift from stockholder to stakeholder-focused capitalism, but no other organization except the Conference Board is really looking at what it means for the C-Suite. So we're just getting this underway. But I think a few things are pretty clear. First, it affects the skills that you're looking for when it comes to your CEO and other senior executives. We've seen this during this pandemic, for example, that what you need in your senior executives now is what one CEO recently described as being radically human. You know, you're just not this sort of...
No more robots, huh?
Well, you don't want someone who's just playing CEO. You want someone that your employees, your customers, and others can really relate to. And so I think things like credibility with employees, not just with investors and boards, is going to be increasingly important. And an ability to communicate with multiple stakeholders is also critically important. I think for the C-Suite more broadly, what this means is greater collaboration across the C-Suite, because issues will no longer be able to be addressed in just a siloed way. You know, the ESG issues have gone mainstream. And so general counsels have to weigh in, CFOs have to weigh in. It's not just your corporate citizenship and your sustainability people. So I think there's going to be a sort of change in skill set, increased collaboration across the C-Suite. I think it may even change the composition of the C-Suite. We've got a survey underway right now where we're finding that at about 30% of the companies, the individual who is responsible for sustainability, whether their name is Chief Sustainability Officer or not, is actually a direct report to the CEO. So it may involve expanding the C-Suite.
Yeah. You know, here I thought that AI was going to take over everything, and you're taking a radical approach by putting humans back in charge here, Paul. It's a wonderful thing. When I was a CEO, it was always a challenge. And, you've run governance, at various organizations. It's always a challenge to take the demands of all of these constituents. The stockholders want, shareholder return day in, day out, every quarter. They want to, be able to see that, that trend consistently. The sustainability folks, want everything to be perfect from an environmental standpoint. Employees want it to be paid the most. Customers want it free. How does a management team balance all of these competing demands?
Carefully. No, seriously, it's ever been a challenge, and it's just a more complicated challenge now. So a very practical step that companies can take is to add to their decision-making matrices impact on employees, impact on customers, impact on society, impact on the environment. I mean, I'll give you a very practical example. When I worked at Time Warner, we added to our decision-making criteria for M&A investor views. We also did that for executive compensation. It's not the worst thing in the world if you're considering M&A to think about, okay, what's the impact on employees? What's the impact on our customers? What's the impact on society and even the environment? Because sometimes a merger could be really good for the environment because the combined company will have greater resources to have a more sustainable business model. So I think just adding in those other constituencies into your decision-making model is helpful. But I would say that helps, but it is still a difficult balancing job for the board. And there is no silver bullet. I mean, even companies that have declared themselves purpose-driven, that is, they exist to address a societal or environmental issue, we've done research on this. And even at those companies, having a purpose doesn't eliminate the need for difficult trade-offs. It's really just a matter of the board collecting all the information it needs, and maybe with a wider aperture than in the past, to make the most informed decisions.
Yeah, I mean, it all has to work. I mean, you can't pay the employees nothing or take advantage of the employees for the benefit of the customer. You can't just give everything to the customer or else you'd make more money. You can't just say we're going to maximize shareholder value and take it all, because none of that leads to a sustainable business model. The only way to have a sustainable business model is to take care of each of the constituents in balance in a way that is consistent with the values of the company, so that the company thrives and grows and is sustainable for the long run. I mean, it just seems like common sense to me.
It does seem like common sense. And in all honesty, I think that sometimes companies just get tangled up in a lot of the latest lingo in this area. And in some ways, conveying it the way you just did, would be enormously helpful for companies, rather than trying to fit things into the silo of sustainability or something like that. Just really say, this is our business strategy and this is how we're going to run the company. And then communicating that clearly and consistently across different constituencies would be enormously helpful.
And how that's good for all of them, in the right way. The final thing is, this time horizon. When I was the CEO, I had the index funds who were in it forever, the so-called permanent capital. You had people who had bought in and then, wanted to sell at a certain point, a couple quarters down the road. You had the hedge funds that wanted to buy in, a second ago and sell a minute from now. I mean, so you had all of these competing things, and then everybody was criticizing boards and CEOs for being too short term, when in fact it was exactly the opposite. It was management teams and boards of directors who were the only ones with a consistent forever timeline. How do you advise boards and management teams to deal with all these disparate timelines?
Well, my hope is that as companies focus on these multiple stakeholders, even though some of the employees will have a shorter time horizon and some customers will as well, just like your investors do, what this whole effort of a multi-stakeholder governance approach is about is actually looking at the long-term future of the company. And I think by focusing on these other constituencies and their long-term welfare will help buttress boards and management in making long-term decisions. And I have some hope in this regard, because I am seeing actually a transformation in the investment community. And it's not just the growth of so-called ESG funds, right? There was a report out in November that said that ESG investments, assets under management, represented 1/3 of the $52 trillion in assets in the United States. I think it's much more than that. I think it's that stockholders are thinking more like and about stakeholders than in the past. We saw this when we convened investors representing $12 trillion worth of assets this past September to ask them about what they thought companies should be doing on race, economy, and health. And, it was striking to hear both passive and active investors. No, candidly, we didn't have any activists in the room, but a wide range of mainstream investors saying there are systemic risks here if companies are not thinking about the long-term welfare of their other stakeholders. And frankly, we'll hold you accountable, boards, if you don't do so. Now, we'll see how that holds, but I do think that there is an evolution in the approach in the investment community, which bodes well for longer-term thinking.
Well, I think this comes back to your point that it's not an either or kind of thing, or it's not just you can't just pick one, because in order to produce long-term shareholder value, you have to take care of all the other constituents, the customers, employees. In order to take care of your customers and produce that return, you have to provide the best quality products and services at a great price. In order to make all of that work, you need to take care of your employees and remunerate them. I mean, it all has to work in a collaborative fashion, or there is no long term. And I think that's what you've written about. And it just, again, it comes back to, a lot of common sense. But I agree with you. I think today shareholders are really, converging on this whole point.
Yeah, and I think that may be why I'm most confident that multi-stakeholder approach is going to be durable. There will be administrations will come and go, regulations will come and go, but I think there is a sort of seismic shift underway in the investment community that will set a new standard. So going back to Milton Friedman, yeah, you can actually run your company really focusing on serving your stockholders, but you know what? Your stockholders are people too. Your stockholders are people who are thinking about the broader societal and environmental impacts that companies have. They're thinking about these other stakeholders. So serving stockholders and serving stakeholders are really one and the same.
We've been talking to Paul Washington, the Executive Director of the ESG Center of the Conference Board. Paul, thanks for joining us today and providing our listeners with a roundup of insights on multi-stakeholder governance. Every few weeks, I'll be joined by a different leader of one of our centers or CEOs of our member companies, both in the U.S. and around the globe, to provide insights on the biggest issues that are keeping executives up at night. We'll cover leading topics in public policy, environmental, social, and governance, marketing and communications, the economy, and human capital. We hope you've enjoyed this podcast, C-Suite Perspectives, and that you'll listen and share this with your colleagues as your business tackles the challenges brought about by these fast-paced and uncertain times. I'm Steve Odland, and this podcast has been brought to you by the Conference Board.
You've been listening to C-Suite Perspectives, a podcast series from the Conference Board that delivers trusted insights for what's ahead to the nation's business leaders. Find this podcast and others from the Conference Board wherever you find your podcasts.